I just wanted to make scrambled eggs, like good scrambled eggs. 1 dozen turned to like 5 dozen, turned to... I just couldn't stop making eggs. But listen, I definitely figured some things out. After watching this video, your scrambled egg game is gonna be like... I'm gonna teach you how to make perfect scrambled eggs, and it is really easy. But to get there, you have to understand a couple things, and we need to start from the beginning. There are a ton of myths to dispel. So first, what kind of eggs should we buy? There's organic, which means vegetarian feed that's pesticide free. There's cage free, which means the chickens can walk around. There's free range, which means the chickens have some access to outdoors, but it's probably pretty small. And then there's pasture raised, which means the chickens are literally raised outside, which is probably what you think of when you think of chickens being raised on a farm. Keep in mind, pasture raised does not necessarily mean organic. Chickens naturally eat bugs and worms and stuff. Brown eggs generally come from brown chickens, white eggs from white chickens. Otherwise, they're exactly the same, but for some odd reason, I think I still prefer the brown. Despite all those labels, from my testing, there is absolutely no correlation between the labels and the quality of the eggs. While pasture-raised eggs are generally the most expensive, there is no correlation between cost and the quality of the eggs. So there is nothing wrong with buying the cheap stuff. You're looking for smooth but intense flavor with deep yellow yolks. Which eggs you use really does make a difference, but you won't be able to tell which ones are the good ones based on the marketing or the price. Personally, I get the Whole Foods brown eggs. It's great flavor, great quality. If you're looking to spend a little bit more money for basically the same quality, I would go with Vital Farms or Happy Egg. We're just getting started here. I got some French eggs about to go on, and I've already got some Chinese style steamed eggs. First, we have the French or fancy chef style. This was popularized by Jacques Pepin, Julia Child, and more recently, Gordon Ramsay. This style is well appreciated amongst chefs, I think because it's so labor intensive, but the labor is not necessarily skilled labor. You just mix it. The real skill is in making sure that you don't cook the eggs too slowly so that they don't dry out. Any more than like 10 minutes and these eggs will turn into glue. This is really why a lot of chefs will add creme fraiche or sour cream or just cream at the end. That arrests the cooking, but it also adds moisture back into the eggs. These eggs taste fantastic over toast, but alone they're just too rich, too dense, and they don't have that lightness that we're looking for. These may be Gordon Ramsay's favorite eggs, but they're not mine. Now, Chinese steamed eggs are kind of the opposite. They're mixed with a lot of water and they're steamed until they're this real smooth texture. They're really custardy and they're kind of their own thing. They're not exactly the scrambled eggs that we are looking for. Korean steamed eggs are much closer. They use less water and they're scrambled while cooking. While they do come out light and airy, they are boiled, so the curds themselves are kind of dry and the overall taste depends on the cooking liquid. These are really great over rice with some sesame oil drizzled on top, but again, not exactly the scrambled eggs that we are looking for. Someone told me you can make eggs in the microwave. I had to dig my microwave out of the basement because I live in the city and I don't have space for one. And yes, it's true, you can make eggs in the microwave. It's actually pretty easy. You just pulse the microwave for like 15 seconds at a time and you mix in between until they come out to be scrambled eggs. This surprisingly imitates eggs cooked over really low heat over the stove, but I don't like the result because if you're trying to get bigger curds, they tend to dry out. Ironically, I found this to be the best way to make the French style eggs. Instead of like 10 minutes laboring over the stove, it's like 2 minutes in the microwave tops. And there's no need to add cream at the end because there's almost no moisture loss. So yeah, Gordon Ramsay's favorite eggs are microwave eggs.
Every time we get a new cook in the kitchen, we always ask them to make scrambled egg. And if they can make the perfect scrambled egg, you know they know how to cook properly.
Another Asian technique is to create sheets and layers of egg folded on top of each other, usually in a wok. Unfortunately, the high heat used doesn't allow the use of butter, which we definitely want. And also these eggs tend to come out kind of oily. American style scrambled eggs are actually very similar, except they're cooked with butter over lower heat, and the large curds are not necessarily in sheets. These come out super velvety and creamy and amazing. This is the style that we are targeting. This is a carbon steel omelet pan. It's kind of like cast iron, but with a much smoother surface. This is a carbon steel wok. It's also very smooth and relatively non-stick. Both are perfectly fine to use. What you don't want to use is a modern cast iron pan because the surface is way too rough. It doesn't perform like grandma's cast iron from 50 years ago. My weapon of choice is actually this non-stick pan I got at Walmart for like $6. I'm serious. Non-stick pans are basically disposable. The cheaper, the better, and in fact, the cheaper ones actually have like a slicker surface. This one has actually lasted me over 2 years because it never sees high heat, and this silicone spatula is the only utensil that touches it. Now we have a bit of controversy. Eggs actually taste pretty good, just barely beaten. But unless you're cooking them to basically dry, you end up with these thick streaks of uncooked white. They just don't cook fast enough and they end up slimy. The Asian technique of frying the egg before scrambling sort of solves the problem by allowing you to cook the whites first, but makes it hard to season and comes out oily. One idea is to separate the whites and beat them separately and then add the yolks back in. But then the whites get too frothy and the eggs turn out with this foamy mouthfeel. Honestly, it's just best to beat the eggs until they form this homogeneous texture. It's pretty hard to overbeat them and you're not trying to incorporate air like a lot of people think. Definitely don't add sparkling water or baking soda to try and get in extra air. That foamy mouthfeel is not pleasant. Now the temperature that we cook at turns out to be really important. Lower heat gives you a more homogeneous texture, while higher heat gives you more bite in the folds, but simultaneously also seems to leave more moisture. Often eggs that are cooked over low heat will look more moist, but they'll actually be drier. We really want to use as much heat as we can without browning the butter, which on my stove is medium to medium high. So how often do you stir? I found that the more you stir, the lighter the eggs come out, but actually you want the eggs to have some bite. So it's actually best to mix as little as possible. The best way to do this is to allow a layer of cooked eggs to form in the pan, then pull those eggs out of the way and let the liquid redistribute in the pan. You repeat this process maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 plus times, just kind of depending on how many eggs you have and how big your pan is. As far as adjuncts go, butter is king. In the interest of not turning your eggs into butter soup, I would recommend about a half tablespoon of butter per egg. That seems like a lot, but you could really double that and it would still taste pretty good. A lot of folks like to add cold, unmelted butter to the eggs while they're mixing, but I actually found melting the butter in the pan first and then adding the eggs really gave the most buttery flavor. Some folks swear by adding liquid to the eggs, and honestly I found that basically all liquid additions can improve the texture of the eggs. A slightly runnier texture actually cooks a little bit better and it keeps them silky in the pan. Liquids generally lighten the flavor, but they also impart their own flavor.
All right, we have lots of milk, a little bit of milk, and no milk at all. Yeah, it tastes kind of milky. It literally tastes like milk.
Adding milk actually just ends up making your eggs taste milky. I would not recommend that. Cream is a lot better. It actually mimics a really mild egg, but my favorite is water. It preserves the flavor of the egg, it just turns the volume down a little bit. So if you don't like how your eggs taste, I would add some cream. If you do like how your eggs taste, but it's just a little too rich, add some water. But despite the texture improvements, if you're really careful with your cooking and your technique, you really don't need to add any liquid. Some folks add extra yolks, but I found adding extra whites actually was preferable because it improved the bite of the eggs a little bit. Honestly, I wouldn't mess with the yolk to white ratio. Nature kind of wins here.
We have 1/16 of a teaspoon 1/8 of a teaspoon, and no salt at all.
Now, here was a surprise. Salt adds richness, which I actually found to be undesirable. It pains me to say this because I love salt, but you want to use a little bit of salt, not a lot, like very little, like 1/32 of a teaspoon per egg or less. You should be able to like count the grains of salt in your hand per egg. And now for more egg controversy. Gordon Ramsay says you shouldn't pre-salt your eggs because they turn gray and watery. Serious Eats says you should pre-salt your eggs, something about denaturing the proteins and producing a softer texture. Gordon Ramsay is technically wrong, but Serious Eats is completely wrong. What makes eggs watery is letting them sit at room temperature. And if they sit pre-mixed, they'll actually turn a darker yellow.
You can see the color difference is pretty significant with the ones that were left out versus the one that was rested inside the eggshell itself.
That color of the mixed eggs doesn't actually change the final color of the scrambled eggs. What turns them gray is actually pepper. So if you're going to use pepper, definitely do not add it until the very end. But here's the thing, leaving eggs with salt actually turns them rubbery. That's the opposite of what Serious Eats found. I've tested this many times and it's just the truth. I hate to say it, but Gordon Ramsay was right on this one. Don't salt your eggs until just before it hits the pan. This is actually probably one of the biggest reasons why restaurant eggs are not as good as homemade eggs. They mix up a bunch of eggs ahead of time and they pre-season them, and that salt turns them rubbery. Sugar in small quantities actually has an impressive ability to brighten the eggs without adding a sweet flavor. It sort of mimics the flavor of chives or onion. I don't know why, but it does. Speaking of chives, they look great, but you need a ton of chives to add any flavor to scrambled eggs. In contrast, there's green onions, which add a ton of flavor, but they get this vegetal texture, so I actually vote chives. Vinegar is common with poached eggs, but I definitely would not add it to any scramble. There's some sort of chemical reaction that actually prevents curd formation. Interestingly, this is also true about creme fraiche, Dijon mustard, and sour cream. So definitely none of those things go in the eggs until they're already scrambled.
Lots of soy sauce, a little bit of soy sauce, and just a sprinkle of salt. Not very salty, but it's actually got kind of like a bean flavor to it. Or that one.
The first one.
Oh, the first one? Okay. All right. So you like the one without the soy sauce.
Soy sauce supposedly adds umami, but I found it to just kind of like discolor the eggs and add this strong bean flavor.
For an Asian style, just a touch of soy sauce, but if you put too much, it gets brown. I still prefer just a little bit of salt though.
Shaoxing wine is an interesting pairing with soy sauce. It adds a really nice nutty flavor, but again, only in the smallest amounts because it gets really boozy really quickly. Sesame oil is another way of adding nuttiness, but be careful, these flavors overpower quickly. Bouillon adds a savory flavor, but it ends up tasting kind of chickeny, which isn't great. You'd think MSG would be a great alternative, but somehow that ends up tasting kind of artificial. It turns out dashi powder is actually the secret sauce. In really small amounts, it adds a deep umami flavor without coming off fishy. For keeping eggs moist, cornstarch is actually a classic Chinese technique. One that I used to use until I found out that cornstarch actually makes eggs slimy, even in the smallest amounts. So definitely no starch. None. How about topping with cheese? That's classic, right? Cheddar cheese actually masks the flavor of the eggs because it adds a tinge of sourness. Parmesan is a little bit better, but it still has some of that sourness. I did find Gruyere to be mild enough to not cover up the eggs, but it doesn't really add anything other than a little bit of textural and visual interest. All right, enough talk. Let's actually make some eggs. We'll start with simple but perfect scrambled eggs. 2 eggs beaten with a small pinch of salt. Melt a tablespoon of butter on medium heat. After that first layer of eggs forms, break it up so the liquid egg can run underneath it. From here, just fold the layers back onto themselves. Now you gotta pull the eggs at the perfect time, when they're still glossy but no liquid runs. You only have about a 5-second window, so that's the only part that takes practice. And I don't recommend serving these eggs over toast. The texture is delicate and the flavor is nuanced. You lose all of that biting through a big hunk of bread. Wait a minute, that's it? After all these experiments, you're telling me the best way to make scrambled eggs is just a little bit of butter and salt? Yeah, kind of. Cooking is really about balance. It's not about adding the most ingredients or cooking it on the lowest heat for the longest amount of time, trying to inject the most flavor. Good eggs, the right amount of butter, the right amount of salt, medium heat, and just the right amount of time. Perfect eggs every time. These are better than any scrambled eggs I've ever gotten at a restaurant, ever. I'm serious. Now you can modify this with anything from our notes earlier that sounded good to you. As a bonus, I'm gonna borrow a little bit from our experiments and create my version of the ultimate scrambled eggs. This time we'll do 4 eggs, a small pinch of salt, a much smaller pinch of dashi, a 1/4-inch teaspoon of sugar, and a whole bunch of chopped chives. Melt 2 tablespoons of butter. Cook similarly to before, but more eggs does mean more time and more folding. Now on the plate, a very small sprinkle of Gruyere cheese on top and a slight crack of black pepper. Balance is the key word. Less is more.
All right, I gotta have a taste here. Wow. Wow.
These are the best scrambled eggs I've had in my entire life. I'm serious. It only took like 5 minutes too. Yeah, some of the ingredients were a little bit more expensive, but honestly, the simple scrambled eggs were pretty close to this. You don't really need fancy ingredients to make perfect scrambled eggs. You just need knowledge and technique. Now you know everything there is to know about scrambled eggs. You're a scrambled eggs expert. I bet you have butter and eggs and salt in your fridge right now, so you're about 5 minutes away from the best scrambled eggs you've ever had in your entire life. Go forth, my friends, and good luck on your egg journey. I didn't do a single egg pun in this whole thing. That's what people would have expected.